Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to 360 Aviation Academy. Today we shall fly the beautiful Airbus 320 aircraft to the scenic city of Port Blair in India. Today's class is going to focus on the GS Mini or the ground speed mini function of the Airbus 320. What is GS Mini? To understand this, let's look at the indicated airspeed target on your primary flight display. You will notice that the aircraft is maintaining an approach speed of approximately 165 knots. We are of course on the localizer towards Port Blair, and if you look at the flight management system, you will notice that the aircraft has calculated the V approach to be 135 knots. If the aircraft has calculated an approach speed of 135 knots, then why are we maintaining 165 knots on the indicated speed target? Why is the aircraft doing so? To understand that, let's look at the FCOM or the Flight Crew Operating Manual. Ground Speed Mini Function Principle. The purpose of the ground speed mini function is to take advantage of the aircraft inertia when the wind conditions vary during the approach. It does so by providing the flight crew with an adequate indicated speed target. When the aircraft flies this indicated speed target, the energy of the aircraft is maintained above a minimum level, ensuring standard aerodynamic margins versus stall. So what is this minimum energy level? To understand this, you have to see the headwind component or the headwinds that the aircraft is currently experiencing. You can see that we are experiencing a direct headwind of 38 knots, well approximately 40 knots of headwind. Yet if you look at the FMS, the ATIS has reported that we'll be landing with just 10 knots of headwind. So at 2000 feet, we are experiencing 40 knots of headwind, but by the time we land, these headwinds will die down to just 10 knots. That means all the excess energy that we have right now, please remember, more headwinds means more lift. So all this energy will slowly die away as we commence the landing into Port Blair. To keep this safety margin in check, the Airbus has introduced the concept of ground speed mini. In ground speed mini, if you look at the formula, Airbus talks about computing the ground speed mini using the formula GS mini is equal to V approach minus tower headwind component. Let's have a look. So the GS mini is equal to the V approach. Today the V approach is 135 knots minus the tower headwind component. So this winds over here that we insert on the FMS is the ATIS winds or the ATC reported winds at the time of landing. So if you look at the V approach 135 and we subtract the headwinds of 10 knots, we get a GS mini a value of 125 knots. So then why are we maintaining 165 knots? Again, to understand this, let's look at the FCOM. So what the aircraft does is compute an indicated speed target using the GS mini. So GS mini plus the current headwind component. So what is the GS mini? We just computed it at 125 knots. And how much is the current headwind component? The aircraft is currently experiencing almost 40 knots of headwind. So 125 knots of GS mini plus 40 knots of headwind will give you your indicated speed target of 165 knots. To put it simply, the concept is the GS mini is the minimum energy level the aircraft will always maintain. If you have more headwinds, then obviously the aircraft will maintain a higher energy speed. If you have less headwinds, the aircraft will maintain a lesser speed. This obviously is to prevent the aircraft energy from suddenly washing away when you execute the landing. Another key fact to remember is the GS mini is simply a target speed. The indicated airspeed over here can be flown regardless of autopilot or auto thrust functionality. So even if I switch off the auto thrust, let me show you. I am now currently switching off the auto thrust. Watch over here. I have switched off the auto thrust and the aircraft still maintains this indicated airspeed target, which is computed with GS mini in mind. So even without the auto thrust, you can perfectly fly the speed target. You just have to manually increase or decrease the thrust to fly the speed target. Additional points to remember is, please remember, if you look at the FCOM says the same thing over here, that the speed target is displayed on the PFD speed scale in magenta when approach phase and managed speed is active. So you need to have these two criteria to be met for you to receive the GS Mini functionality. Approach speed, approach phase has to be activated and the speed has to be managed. Additionally, it is independent of the autopilot or flight directors or auto thrust engagements. I have just shown you that even with the auto thrust off, the speed target remains and you can still see the ground speed mini function with the help of the indicated airspeed target. Additionally, points to remember is, if you have stronger headwinds, as you can see over here with the headwind gust, your speed target will automatically increase to cater for the energy dying down at the time of landing. Now let's have a look at how the aircraft performs on the approach with the GS Mini functionality. So let's continue the approach. Now we are approaching the final approach fix over here into Port Blair, and we're doing a non-position approach, that is a localizer only approach. So let's put the track FPA and let's select a track of -3 degrees, which is the Port Blair's final approach. And here we go. Commencing the approach now. So you can see that the aircraft has commenced its final approach into Port Blair City. So now you will notice that the indicated airspeed target will slowly reduce as we get closer and closer to the runway, because your headwinds will slowly die down. Right now we are experiencing 40 knots of headwinds, and as we commence the final approach, as we commence our descent into Port Blair City, these headwinds will slowly die down. Therefore, your indicated airspeed target will also slowly start washing off. Please observe, the winds are now at 34 knots, and now you can see that your indicated airspeed target has now become 160. Please remember that our V approach is 135 knots today. So the speed will eventually wash off and reach 135 knots as your headwinds slowly die down. Now we are getting closer and closer to Port Blair, the runway in Port Blair, that is runway 04, and let's have a look again at your primary flight display. You will notice now that the winds have almost touched 30 knots and the winds are slowly, the indicated airspeed is slowly decreasing to 150 knots. As the energy of the aircraft slowly dies away due to reducing headwinds, the aircraft's indicated airspeed target is also slowly reducing. We are now barely 4 nautical miles from the runway and we are crossing an altitude of 800 feet. Now the winds have died down to almost 25 knots and you can see the indicated airspeed target is slowly approaching your V approach speed of 135 knots. Finally, if you look outside, we are almost about to execute the landing now. We are barely 400 feet now from the runway, and now you will see that the winds have almost reached the tower observed winds, that is 10 knots of headwinds. It's almost there. We are just barely 20 knots of headwinds, and you can see that the V approach now, the actual indicated airspeed is just maintaining barely 10 knots above the V approach. Finally, as the aircraft executes the final approach to landing barely 50 feet above the runway, you will notice that the winds have now died down to barely 15 knots and slowly washing away to 10 knots, and now the aircraft has approached its actual V approach of close to 135 knots. This, ladies and gentlemen, is called the Ground Speed Mini. Again, to recap, the GS Mini is a feature introduced to take care of headwind gusts. If we have strong headwinds on the approach, the aircraft automatically maintains a higher indicated airspeed target above your V approach to ensure that a safe margin is maintained. So by the time you land, you will notice that your headwinds will die down, your lift will die down. But because we have catered for this additional safety margin or additional speed margin, the aircraft speed will slowly die down to just your V approach speed. But it will not go below your V approach speed, ensuring a safe margin above stall. I hope you've enjoyed your lesson today on the Ground Speed Mini or the GS Mini. And once again, thank you for choosing 360 Aviation Academy. We'll see you next time.